I bought the dress on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the clearance aisle of a small boutique 2 blocks from my apartment. It wasn't silk. It wasn't designer. It didn't come with a brand name people recognized. It cost $50, tax included, and I remember standing there longer than necessary, touching the fabric, asking myself if it looked cheap. Not because I thought it was, but because I knew exactly who would. My family had always had a way of turning ordinary choices into quiet verdicts. Not loud insults. Not direct attacks. Just small reactions that landed heavy. A raised eyebrow. A laugh that came half a second too late. Comment disguised as humor. I bought the dress anyway. It was soft. Navy blue. Simple cut. Something I could wear behind the counter at my store without feeling like I was playing a role. Something that felt like me. That mattered more than I wanted to admit. The dinner was supposed to be casual. Just family, my mom had said over the phone. No big deal. No pressure. But family dinners never came without evaluation. When I walked into the restaurant, I felt it immediately. That old awareness. The subtle scan. The mental preparation. My sister looked me up and down first. Not obviously. Just enough. Then she smiled. "Oh," she said. "That's cute." My brother laughed. Not loudly. Just a breath of air through his nose. My dad tilted his head. My mom blinked twice. "How much was that dress?" my mom asked, already smiling like she knew the answer. $50, I said. There it was. The laugh wasn't explosive. That would have been easier. It was collective. Shared. Like an inside joke I wasn't part of. 50, my sister repeated. Wow. That's economical, my dad added. I guess when you work retail, you get used to budget fashion, my brother said, raising his glass. I smiled. The way I always did. Practiced smile. The one that said, I heard you, but I'm not going to react. But something inside me folded in on itself. Not because of the dress. Because of the familiarity. I had heard this tone my whole life. When I bought my first car. When I moved into my first apartment. When I opened my store instead of taking a real job. Always the same message. We don't take you seriously. Dinner moved on. Conversations shifted. But the damage had already settled. It always did quietly. Later that night, as I hung the dress back in my closet, I stood there longer than necessary again. Not because I regretted buying it, but because I realized something uncomfortable. No matter what I wore, no matter how much it cost, no matter how carefully I chose, they had already decided how much I was worth. And at the time, I still didn't know how much worse it was about to get. 'Cause 3 days later, my phone rang. And suddenly, that $50 dress wasn't funny anymore. 3 days after that dinner, I was opening my store when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was still early. The street outside was quiet, the metal shutter halfway up, sunlight cutting across the floor in thin lines. I didn't check the screen right away. I was busy arranging a display, smoothing fabric, lining things up the way I liked them. Then the phone buzzed again. This time I glanced. Mom. That alone tightened something in my chest. She never called during my work hours unless she wanted something. Not to ask how business was going. Not to say she was proud. Just something. I answered. Hi, Mom. Her tone was bright. Too bright. The same tone she used when she was about to reframe reality. Sweetheart. I hope I didn't catch you at a bad time. I just opened, I said. Oh, good, she replied, relieved. Then you're not busy yet. I didn't correct her. She paused for a moment, like she was choosing her words carefully. So listen, she began, your Aunt Carol is having that charity luncheon this weekend. The one at the country club. I pictured it instantly. Linen tablecloths. People who never looked at price tags. The same crowd that had laughed at my $50 dress. And I asked, "Well," she continued, "your sister mentioned that you own a clothing store now." Now, as if it were a recent hobby she'd just discovered. "Yes," I said slowly. Mom laughed lightly. "She said you sell dresses." "I do." Another pause. "So we were thinking," she said, "maybe you could help us out." Help us out. The phrase landed with a dull thud. "We were wondering if you could give us a family discount. For the luncheon. Something nice. Elegant. Not, She hesitated. Not too casual." I leaned against the counter, my fingers gripping the edge. "A discount?" I repeated. "Yes," she said quickly. "Nothing crazy. Just a little something. Since we're family." Family. 3 days ago, they had laughed at my dress. 3 days ago, my work had been cute. 3 days ago, my choices had been entertainment. Now suddenly, my store was useful. I looked around the space I'd built from scratch. The racks I'd assembled myself. The inventory I'd paid for with savings and sleepless nights. The rent I covered every month without help. "How much of a discount?" I asked. Mom cleared her throat. "Well, your sister was hoping for at least 50%, maybe more. Since it's for a good cause." I almost laughed. "Almost." 50%, I said slowly. "Yes," she replied, as if this were reasonable. "You get your merchandise at wholesale anyway, right?" That was the moment something inside me shifted. They had no idea how my business worked. No idea how thin my margins were. No idea what it took to keep the lights on. But they felt entitled to the benefit. I closed my eyes for a second. Just one. Then I opened them. "And the dress I wore to dinner?" I asked. "What about it?" Mom said, confused. "The $50 one," I continued. "The one everyone laughed at." There was silence on the line. "Oh," she said lightly. "That was just teasing. You're too sensitive. Too sensitive." "But now you want a discount," I said. "Well, yes," she replied, irritation creeping in. "That's different. This is business. Business." I let that word sit between us. In that moment, I understood something with brutal clarity. They didn't respect my work. They respected what they could extract from it. And for the first time, I didn't rush to smooth things over. I didn't laugh it off. I didn't shrink. I said, "I'll think about it." Mom exhaled sharply. "Why do you need to think about it?" "'Cause 3 days ago you laughed at me. 'Cause you still don't see me. 'Cause I'm done pretending this is normal." "I'll call you back," I said. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. From anger I'd been trained not to feel. Outside, a customer walked past, glancing in. Inside, I stood alone in the space I'd built, realizing something undeniable. They didn't want me at the table. They wanted access to what I owned. And that realization was going to change everything. After I hung up the phone, the store felt different. Not quieter. Heavier. Like the walls had absorbed the conversation and were waiting to see what I would do with it. I locked the door early that night, flipped the sign to closed, and stood there for a long moment with my hand still on the key. My reflection in the glass looked older than it had that morning. Not tired. Awake. I walked home instead of taking the bus. I needed the movement. The air was cool, the kind that clears your head if you let it. With every step, the words replayed. Family discount. 50%. Wholesale anyway. Too sensitive. Business. Each phrase landed like a pin in a map, outlining a pattern I had been tracing my entire life without naming. At home, I kicked off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the $50 dress. I didn't change. I wanted to stay with the feeling instead of outrunning it. I stared at the closet where the dress now hung among others like it. Simple, practical, chosen with care rather than status in mind. Clothes I bought because they fit my life, not because they impressed anyone else. I thought back to the first time my family laughed at something I owned. I must have been 19. I'd saved for months to buy a second-hand jacket. Leather worn in, perfect. My dad had smirked and asked if it came free with a motorcycle I didn't have. My sister had said it looked thrift store chic, like it was a punchline. I'd laughed with them then. I always did. Laughing was cheaper than defending myself. Then there was the apartment. Car. The job. Every milestone met with the same tone. Mild amusement. Gentle dismissal. Approval always reserved for things that looked expensive, traditional, impressive to strangers. But never for effort. Never for resilience. Never for the quiet pride of building something slowly. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, counting cracks like constellations. My phone sat face down on the nightstand. I didn't check it. I knew what I'd see. A follow-up text. A reminder. Maybe a joke to soften the ask. They always did that. Wrapped entitlement in charm, then acted offended if I hesitated. What unsettled me wasn't the request itself. It was how normal it felt to them. As if my store were an extension of the family resources. As if my labor were communal property. As if my dignity were negotiable. I realized then how often I'd been taught to separate respect from affection. They could love me, they said. Of course they loved me. But respect was conditional. Respect was reserved for outcomes they recognized. Money they understood. Status they could explain to others. Anything outside that framework was cute, actional, discountable. That night, I opened my laptop and pulled up my books. I hadn't planned to. It wasn't strategic. It was grounding. I looked at the numbers. The rent, cost of goods, payroll, utilities, the margins that barely breathed. 50% wasn't a favor. It was a loss. It was me paying for their appearance with my stability. I imagined handing over a dress at half price, watching my mother smile approvingly, my sister posting photos from the luncheon with a caption about supporting local businesses, no tag, no credit. I imagined the laughter again, softer this time because now they'd gotten what they wanted. My chest tightened. Not with fear. With resolve. I closed the laptop and picked up my phone. I opened the family group chat. The last message was from my brother, a meme about retail being easy money. I didn't respond. I scrolled up instead. Years of small dismissals stacked neatly, time-stamped, undeniable. Compliments followed by qualifiers. Praise followed by jokes. Every time I'd minimized myself to keep the peace. I set the phone down again. I wasn't ready to answer them. Not yet. I needed to answer myself first. I asked a question I'd never allowed before. What would it look like if I didn't accommodate this? If I didn't smooth it over? If I didn't trade my self-respect for belonging? The answer scared me. And relieved me. 'Cause for the first time I saw the path clearly. It wasn't about the discount. It was about the line. The one I'd never drawn because I'd been taught lines were rude, ungrateful, disruptive. I slept badly that night. Dreams of racks collapsing, mirrors cracking, voices laughing behind me. But when morning came, the fear had settled into something solid. Determination. I got dressed slowly. Not in the $50 dress. In jeans and a plain top. Clothes that felt like armor in their simplicity. As I unlocked the store, sunlight filled the room again. The space felt lighter, like it was on my side. I knew I couldn't avoid the call forever. I knew the pushback would come. But I also knew something else now, something irreversible. If I gave them this discount, I would be agreeing with their laughter. If I refused, I would finally be disagreeing out loud. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to hear what that disagreement would cost me. The call came the next afternoon, right in the middle of a rush. The bell above the door kept chiming, my hands were full of fabric, my brain juggling sizes and prices and smiles. I let the phone ring once. Twice. I knew who it was. I knew the tone that would follow. I answered anyway, because avoiding it would only drag the moment out longer. "Did you think about it?" my mom asked, skipping the greeting. No hello. No how are you. Straight to the point. "Yes," I said. "And?" she pressed, already impatient. I looked around the store. A young woman was trying on a dress near the mirror, turning side to side, smiling at her reflection in a way that made my chest ache. That smile was why I'd opened this place. Not for status. Not for approval. For moments like that. "I can't do 50%, I said calmly. "It's not sustainable." There was a pause. A sharp inhale. Then a laugh that wasn't warm. "Oh, come on," my mom said. "You're exaggerating. It's one dress. For family." "One dress," I repeated. "At half price. Plus tax. Plus cost. Plus overhead. It adds up." "You're making this very transactional," she replied, her voice cooling. "I thought you cared about helping." Helping. The words slid under my skin. "I do care," I said. "But caring doesn't mean hurting my business." Another pause. This one heavier. "So you're saying no," she said slowly, like she was testing how it sounded. "I'm saying I can offer a small courtesy discount," I replied. 10%. That's what I offer friends and loyal customers. 10%, she scoffed. "That's insulting." Insulting. From the woman who laughed at my work 3 days earlier. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "You know," she continued, her tone sharpening, "your sister was really excited. She told everyone you'd help her look amazing. Now what am I supposed to tell her?" "Tell her the truth," I wanted to say. "That respect isn't optional. That my labor isn't a joke. That family doesn't mean free." Instead, I said, "Tell her the same thing I'm telling you." Silence. Then softer, more dangerous. "You've changed," my mom said. There it was. The accusation disguised as concern. "I've grown," I replied. "That store is making you selfish," she snapped. "You used to be more flexible." Flexible. Another word for bend until you break. "I have customers," I said. "I need to get back to them." "You're choosing money over family," she shot back. "No," I said quietly. "I'm choosing respect over being laughed at." The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, phone still pressed to my ear, feeling something unfamiliar bloom in my chest. Not guilt. Not shame. Pride. Quiet. Steady. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. I set the phone down behind the counter and took a breath. Then another. Customer near the mirror caught my eye. "You okay?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said, and realized I meant it. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I helped people choose dresses. I rang up sales. I smiled. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension tightening like a wire. I knew this wasn't over. Families like mine didn't accept boundaries quietly. They escalated. They recruited. They reframed. That evening, the messages started. "My sister first. Why are you being difficult? Mom said you embarrassed her. It's just one dress. Don't make it weird." Then my brother. "Wow. Didn't know success would go to your head." Guess we know where we stand now. Each message was a tug on the same rope, pulling me back toward the role I'd always played. The accommodator, peacemaker, the one who folded first. I didn't respond. Not right away. I sat on the floor of my apartment, back against the couch, phone in my lap, reading the words again and again. Difficult. Embarrassed. Weird. Head. Stunt. They were trying to rewrite the story in real time. In their version, I wasn't setting a boundary. I was causing a problem. I wasn't protecting my livelihood. I was being greedy. I wasn't reacting to disrespect. I was overreacting to jokes. That realization hit harder than the laughter ever had. I understood then that no explanation would satisfy them. 'Cause explanations implied debate. And debate implied my boundaries were negotiable. They weren't. I typed out a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Every version sounded like a defense. And I was done defending. Instead, I set the phone aside and stood up. I went to the closet. I took out the $50 dress. I laid it on the bed, smoothing the fabric with my hands. It was still soft. Still simple. Still mine. I realized something then, something that made my throat tighten. They had laughed at the dress because they'd laughed at me. And they wanted the discount because they believed I'd still give it. 'Cause I always had. But not this time. I hung the dress back up carefully like it mattered. Like I mattered. Tomorrow I knew would be worse. More messages. More pressure. Maybe a call from my dad. Maybe a passive-aggressive post. They would push. They always did. And for the first time, I didn't brace to give in. I braced to stand. I woke up the next morning already tense, like my body had been bracing for impact before my brain caught up. My phone was face down on the nightstand, exactly where I'd left it, but I didn't need to flip it over to know what I'd find. Families like mine didn't let silence sit. They filled it. They crowded it. They turned it into proof. When I finally picked up the phone, there were 11 unread messages. Not just from my mom this time. From my sister. From my brother. From my Aunt Carol, the same one with the charity luncheon. The group had mobilized. The first message from my mom was short and sharp. We need to talk today. This has gone too far. Too far. As if the line had been crossed by me. My sister's messages came next, longer, emotional, layered with accusation disguised as hurt. I don't understand why you're doing this. Mom was crying last night. You're really going to ruin this over money? Ruin. Over money. My brother didn't bother with emotion. Just facts, at least in his mind. Family helps family. If you can't do that, don't expect favors later. That one sat heavy. Not because it scared me, but because it exposed something I'd never fully admitted before. Every favor I'd ever received had been logged somewhere. Tracked. Stored. Redeemable. Then came Aunt Carol's message. Sweetheart, I hear there's some tension. I hope you remember how much family has always supported you. It would be such a shame to let pride get in the way of generosity. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering, feeling something settle in my chest that felt like clarity mixed with grief. This wasn't about one discount. It wasn't even about my store. It was about obedience. About access. About proving one more time that I would shrink when asked. I set the phone down and sat at the edge of the bed, feet flat on the floor, breathing slowly. I thought about every time I'd been supported. College advice I hadn't followed. The job offers I'd declined. The apartment they'd called temporary. Support had always meant alignment. Approval had always come with conditions. I showered, dressed, and went to work like normal. Unlocking the store felt different that morning. The space felt like a boundary I'd built with my own hands. The racks, the mirrors, the register, none of it existed because my family believed in me. It existed because I had believed in myself when they hadn't. Mid-morning, my dad called. I let it ring longer than I ever had before answering him. That alone felt like a small rebellion. "Hey," he said, his voice calm in that practiced way. "Your mom's pretty upset." "I know," I replied. "She feels disrespected," he continued. "After everything we've done for you." There it was. The ledger. "I didn't disrespect anyone," I said. "I set a boundary." Dad sighed, long and heavy. "You're framing this wrong. This is about family unity. About showing up for each other." "Did you show up for me at dinner?" I asked. "When everyone laughed at my dress?" "That was just teasing," he replied immediately. "You're reading too much into it." I felt my jaw tighten. "You laughed too." Silence. "That's not the point," he said finally. "The point is, you're making this bigger than it needs to be." "No," I said, my voice steady. "I'm finally seeing it for what it is." Another sigh. "Look," he said, softer now. "You've always been independent. That's one of your strengths. But sometimes independence turns into stubbornness. Independence. Stubbornness. Two sides of the same coin depending on whether it served them." "I'm not changing my answer," I said. He paused. "So that's it? You're really willing to damage relationships over a dress?" I closed my eyes. "This isn't about the dress." "But that's what it looks like," he replied. "And that," I said quietly, "is the problem." Call ended without resolution. No agreement. No apology. Just tension suspended in the air. The rest of the day moved slowly. Customers came and went. Compliments flowed. A woman told me my store felt thoughtful. Another said she loved that I carried pieces that didn't feel like fast fashion or status chasing. Each comment felt like a quiet counterweight to the voices in my phone. By evening, the messages had slowed. Not because the issue was resolved, but because they were regrouping. I knew what came next. The reframing. The story they'd tell others. The way I'd be positioned as difficult, ungrateful, dramatic. All because I hadn't complied. And for the first time, that narrative didn't terrify me. 'Cause I understood something essential now. If my value in the family depended on how easily I could be discounted, then their approval was never really mine to lose. That night, I didn't respond to a single message. I cooked dinner. I folded laundry. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself, really looked. Not through their eyes. Through my own. I wasn't greedy. I wasn't selfish. I wasn't dramatic. I was done being convenient. And tomorrow, when they realized I wasn't backing down, the pressure would intensify. I could feel it coming. The guilt. The nostalgia. The warnings. But underneath the anticipation, something else was growing. Resolve. The confrontation didn't come as a single explosion. It came as erosion. Slow. Persistent. Designed to wear me down rather than break me outright. That's how my family always operated when resistance appeared. They didn't demand. They surrounded. It started the following morning with a voicemail from my mom. I didn't listen to it right away. I knew the cadence of her disappointment too well. The sigh before the words. Careful phrasing meant to sound reasonable while carrying weight. I let it sit unread as I opened the store and went through the motions. Unlock. Lights on. Register open. The routine grounded me. By noon, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped into the back room, closed the door, and pressed play. Her voice filled the small space, controlled but trembling at the edges. She talked about how hurt she was, how confused, how she never expected her own daughter to treat family like just another customer. She reminded me of holidays. of sacrifices, of all the times they had been there for me. Not once did she mention the laughter. Not once did she acknowledge the disrespect. The story was already rewritten. She ended with, "Call me when you're ready to be reasonable." Reasonable. That word again. Always used to describe compliance. I didn't call back. An hour later, my sister showed up. I saw her through the front window first, walking toward the door with purpose, sunglasses on, phone in hand like a shield. My stomach dropped, but my feet stayed planted. I watched as she pushed the door open, the bell chiming sharply, drawing the attention of two customers browsing near the racks. She smiled at them. Polite. Performative. Then her eyes locked on me. "Can we talk?" she asked, already moving toward the counter. "Not right now," I said evenly. "I'm working." She laughed, sharp and incredulous. "This is exactly what I mean. You're being dramatic." I gestured toward the customers. "I'll be with you in a few minutes." She huffed, crossed her arms, and waited. I finished helping the customers, rang them up, thanked them, and only then did I turn to my sister. "What do you want?" I asked. Her eyes flicked around the store, taking it in like she was reassessing something she'd underestimated. "Mom is beside herself," she said. "You've turned this into a whole thing." "I didn't turn anything into anything," I replied. "I said no to a discount." She scoffed. "You didn't just say no. You embarrassed us. Aunt Carol had to explain why she couldn't wear something from your store." "That's not my responsibility," I said. "You always say that now," she snapped. "Everything is not your responsibility." "Yes," I said. "Because it isn't." Her face hardened. "Do you know how this makes us look?" There it was. The core of it. Not how it made me feel. Not how I was treated. How it made them look. "I'm not running my business to manage your image," I said. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "You think this little store makes you better than us?" I felt something cold settle in my chest. "No," I said. "I think it makes me independent." She laughed, but it wasn't amused. "Independent," she repeated. "You sell $50 dresses. Let's not get carried away." The words hit sharp and familiar. The same dismissal. The same tone as the dinner. As if nothing I built could ever outweigh their approval. I took a breath. Slow. Deliberate. "Those $50 dresses pay my rent," I said. "They keep this place open. They're not a joke to me." She rolled her eyes. "God, you're so sensitive." That was the moment something snapped into place. Not anger. Understanding. I saw her clearly then. Not as my sister. As an extension of the same system. Same values. Same hierarchy. Same expectation that I would absorb the insult and still deliver the favor. "I'm not giving you the discount," I said. "And if you're here to argue, you need to leave." Her mouth fell open. "You're kicking me out?" "I'm asking you to respect my workplace," I corrected. "If you can't, then yes." She stared at me for a long second, searching for the version of me that would back down. The one who always did. When she didn't find her, her expression shifted to something between shock and fury. "You've changed," she said again. "I know," I replied. She turned and walked out without another word, the bell chiming behind her like punctuation. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, hands trembling. Not with regret. With adrenaline. With the aftershock of doing something I'd never done before. I hadn't apologized. I hadn't explained. I hadn't folded. The rest of the day passed in a blur. By the time I closed the store, my phone was buzzing again. Messages from my mom. From my dad. From my brother. The narrative had fully flipped now. I was no longer the victim of disrespect. I was the aggressor. the divider. The one tearing the family apart. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I realized something both painful and freeing. Their love had always been conditional on my usefulness, on my willingness to give more than I received, on my silence when I was laughed at. The discount wasn't the real test. The test was whether I would finally choose myself. And for the first time, I already had. After my sister left the store, something subtle but unmistakable shifted. Not outside. Inside me. It was like a door had closed behind me, quietly, without drama. I didn't slam it. I didn't lock it. I simply stopped standing in the doorway waiting to be pulled back. That evening, the silence from my family was deliberate. Not calm. Strategic. I knew that silence well. It was the kind meant to make you doubt yourself. To leave space for anxiety to grow. To invite you to fill it with apologies. For years it had worked. This time it didn't. I went through my routine slowly. Closed the store. Counted the register twice. Straightened the racks even though no one would see them until morning. Those small acts felt grounding, like proof that my life still existed even when my family withdrew theirs. At home, I cooked dinner and ate it standing at the counter, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't reach for my phone. I let the quiet stay. I wanted to see what it felt like without their noise in it. Felt unfamiliar. But not empty. Around 9, my phone buzzed. Text from my brother. "We need to talk. You've gone too far." I stared at the screen, noticing how flat the words felt. No curiosity. No concern. Just a verdict. I didn't reply. A few minutes later, another message. "Mom hasn't slept. She's heartbroken. I hope you're happy." There it was. The pivot. Responsibility reassigned. Their discomfort reframed as my fault. I felt the old reflex rise in my chest, the urge to explain, to soften, to fix. I recognized it instantly. And I didn't act on it. Instead, I thought about the dress again. The way they'd laughed. The way none of them had stepped in. The way they'd all joined in without hesitation. I thought about how quickly cute had turned into useful. How easily my work became valuable once it served them. That pattern was clearer now. So clear it hurt. The next day, the fallout became public. Not in a dramatic way. In small signals. My aunt unfollowed my store's page. A cousin I barely spoke to sent a vague message about family being more important than pride. My mom posted a photo from the charity luncheon with a caption about supporting local designers, tagging a boutique I'd never heard of. I stared at that post longer than I should have. Not because I was jealous, but because I finally understood how disposable I was in their story once I stopped complying. And strangely, that understanding brought relief. I stopped expecting fairness from people who benefited from imbalance. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement from people who had never given it freely. I stopped hoping they would suddenly become different if I explained myself better. I didn't block anyone. I didn't announce distance. I simply reduced access. Replies became shorter. Delayed. Neutral. No emotion to grab onto. No argument to escalate. That change unsettled them more than anger ever had. My mom called twice. I let it go to voicemail. My dad texted asking if we could reset. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to punish them. 'Cause I was no longer willing to negotiate my dignity in real time. The store, something else happened. Customers noticed my calm. My focus. One woman told me, "You seem really sure of yourself." I smiled at that. She had no idea how hard-won that certainty was. I realized then that I had spent years asking for permission to take up space, to charge what my work was worth, to say no without justification, to exist without being reduced to a punchline. I wasn't asking anymore. And with that shift came consequences. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones. Invitations stopped. Check-ins faded. The family narrative continued without me, smoother now that I wasn't interrupting it with boundaries. That hurt. Course it did. I'm human. But it also confirmed something essential. My presence had always been conditional. My absence apparently was acceptable. I grieved that quietly. Not the family I had. The family I thought I had if I just tried harder. By the end of that week, I understood something with absolute clarity. I had crossed an invisible line. Not because I refused a discount, but because I refused to play my role. And once you stop playing the role assigned to you, the system has no use for you anymore. That truth used to terrify me. Now it felt like freedom. By the time part 8 settled in, the silence from my family had stretched long enough to stop feeling like a tactic and start feeling like a reality. Days passed without messages. No guilt texts. No dramatic check-ins. Just absence. The kind that reveals how much effort you were carrying when things were normal. What surprised me wasn't that they went quiet. It was how quickly my body relaxed once they did. I woke up without that familiar jolt of anxiety. The one that used to hit the moment my eyes opened before I even remembered why. My mornings became slower. Intentional. I stopped checking my phone first thing. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the street wake up, noticing details I'd always rushed past. Quiet didn't feel like punishment anymore. Felt like permission. The store, I started noticing changes too. Without the constant emotional drain of family tension, my focus sharpened. I rearranged displays with more care. I spent longer talking to customers about what they actually wanted to feel when they wore something, not just how it looked. Sales didn't spike dramatically, but they steadied. And steadiness, I realized, was something my family had never valued. They chased impressions. I was building something sustainable. One afternoon, a regular customer lingered near the counter. She held up a dress, turned it in the light, and said, "You really know what you're doing here." Not in a polite way. In a matter-of-fact way. As if it were obvious. Comment landed deeper than any compliment my family had ever given me. Because it wasn't laced with surprise. That night, I pulled out a box I'd been avoiding for years. Old photos. Birthday cards. Programs from school plays and graduations. I sat on the floor and went through them slowly. Patterns emerged that I hadn't let myself see before. In photos, I was often slightly off to the side. In cards, praise was brief, quickly followed by advice. In every milestone, there was an undercurrent of good, but I didn't feel angry flipping through those memories. I felt clarity. Kind that settles things permanently. I saw how early I'd learned to shrink excitement, to lower expectations, to accept being the supporting character in my own story. And I realized something important. They hadn't taught me humility. They'd taught me to disappear. That realization didn't break me. It solidified me. I began rewriting small things. The way I talked about my work. The way I introduced myself. I stopped downplaying. Stopped joking about just a little store. When people asked what I did, I said, "I own a clothing boutique," and let the words stand on their own. No apology. No qualifier. My family still hadn't reached out. But their absence no longer felt loud. Felt distant. Manageable. Like background noise from a life I was no longer living. I also noticed how often I'd confused love with access. How I'd believed that if I cut off access, I was being cruel. Now I understood understanding something simple and radical. Love doesn't require unlimited entry. And boundaries don't erase care. They define where care can exist safely. One evening, my mom finally texted, "I don't recognize you anymore." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I realized something almost ironic. For the first time in my life, that was true. I didn't recognize myself either. Not the old version. And that felt like progress. I didn't reply. Instead, I locked the store, walked home under a sky turning purple with dusk, and thought about how much of my identity had been built in opposition to their expectations. How much energy I'd spent proving I wasn't a disappointment. I wasn't proving anything now. I was choosing. Choosing what kind of business owner I wanted to be. Choosing what kind of daughter I could be without self-erasure. Choosing what kind of life didn't require me to be laughed at to be loved. The $50 dress still hung in my closet. I wore it again, this time without thinking about them at all. Customer complimented it. I thanked her and moved on. No story attached. By the end of part A, I understood something that felt permanent. I wasn't waiting for them to come around. I wasn't planning reconciliation speeches in my head. I wasn't preparing for the moment they'd finally see me. I was already living in a version of my life where their approval wasn't a currency. And once you stop trading in that currency, you realize how expensive it always was. By the time part 9 began, the distance between me and my family wasn't something I was maintaining anymore. It was something that existed naturally, like space created after a door closes and no one rushes to open it again. What surprised me most was how much truth that distance revealed. Without constant interaction, there was nothing to reinterpret, nothing to soften, nothing to excuse. Patterns stood on their own. I started noticing how often I used to make myself available in anticipation of needs that were never clearly expressed. I had lived on standby. Emotionally, practically, mentally, always prepared to respond, to help, to accommodate. That readiness had felt like loyalty. Now I saw it for what it was. Conditioning. Once I stopped offering myself automatically, the requests didn't become more respectful. They became louder, then rarer, then resentful. And finally, they stopped. That progression told me everything I needed to know. At the store, I made changes I'd postponed for years. I adjusted pricing to reflect actual value. I stopped apologizing when explaining costs. I trained myself to pause before saying yes to anything that felt like a drain rather than an exchange. Customers noticed the shift, even if they couldn't name it. There was more confidence in my voice, more certainty in my posture. People trust clarity. I had been depriving myself of that trust for years. One afternoon, a woman about my mother's age came in, holding a dress I'd designed myself. She asked if I ever offered discounts for special occasions. The old reflex twitched. The urge to explain, to justify, to soften the no. I felt it rise and then pass. I price my work so I can keep doing it, I said simply. She nodded. That makes sense, she replied and paid full price. That moment stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic. 'Cause it was normal, respectful, clean. I realized how rare that kind of interaction had been in my family. How often my worth had been treated as negotiable. The silence from them continued. Weeks now. Long enough that it stopped feeling temporary. I wondered if they were waiting for me to blink. For me to miss them loudly. For me to come back with an apology shaped like a compromise. I didn't. Instead, I started building rituals that belonged only to me. Sunday mornings at a cafe where no one knew my last name. Evening walks without my phone. A notebook where I wrote plans that didn't factor in anyone else's opinion. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of presence. I also allowed myself to feel the grief properly. Not the sharp grief of a fight. The slow grief of acceptance. Accepting that my family loved me within limits they would never question. Accepting that respect wasn't something I could earn by being smaller or more generous or more flexible. That grief didn't collapse me. It matured me. I stopped explaining my situation to friends in detail. Not because I was hiding it, because it no longer required narration. Truth had settled into my bones. When people asked how my family was, I said, "We're distant right now," and let the sentence end there. No defense. No bitterness. Just fact. One night, I realized I hadn't checked my family group chat in days. When I opened it, nothing new waited for me. No messages. No updates. No demand for my attention. The realization landed softly. This was what it looked like when I wasn't useful. And somehow that didn't hurt the way it used to, because I wasn't measuring my worth by their need anymore. I was measuring it by my stability, by my peace, by the life that continued to grow even when they weren't watching. I saw clearly then how much energy I'd spent trying to be seen by people who benefited from not seeing me fully. How often I'd mistaken proximity for connection. How much I'd given away for approval that never settled. Part 9 wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational. It was foundational. It was the moment I stopped scanning the horizon for reconciliation and started planting roots where I stood. I wasn't waiting for an invitation back into their version of family. I was building a version of myself that didn't require it. And the more I built, the less room there was for anything that tried to shrink me again. By the time Part 10 unfolded, the shift was no longer subtle. It had weight, shape, direction. I wasn't reacting to distance anymore. I was living inside a structure I had built deliberately, piece by piece, without asking anyone if it was acceptable. First thing that changed was how I made decisions. Not the big ones. The small daily ones. What time I opened the store. Which suppliers I worked with. What inventory I carried. I stopped choosing based on what would sound impressive if mentioned at a family dinner. I chose based on what worked. What aligned? What sustained me? That practical clarity bled into everything else. I noticed how little I explained myself now. How rarely I justified my choices out loud. The words "because I want to" stopped feeling childish and started feeling sufficient. I didn't need to convert anyone to my reasoning. My life wasn't a presentation. It was a process. One afternoon, I raised prices on a small collection I'd been undercharging for years. My hands shook as I typed in the new numbers. Not because they were unreasonable. Because I'd been trained to associate self-valuation with arrogance. When the first item sold at the new price, something loosened in my chest. The world didn't end. No one laughed. No one questioned my right to earn. I thought about how my family would have reacted. The jokes. The disbelief. The comments about knowing your place. And for the first time, their imaginary reactions didn't factor into my choices. They were irrelevant data points from a system I no longer operated within. I also noticed how my body responded to this autonomy. I slept deeper. Ate without rushing. My shoulders stopped creeping toward my ears when my phone buzzed. Even when my parents' names appeared on the screen, which happened once late at night, I didn't feel that familiar drop in my stomach. The message was from my dad. "Hope you're doing well. Let us know when you're ready to talk." I read it once. Then again. It was carefully neutral. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just an invitation framed as patience. As if the issue were timing, not behavior. As if the responsibility to resume contact belonged to me. I didn't respond. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. There was nothing to discuss that didn't require them to first see me as an equal. And they hadn't shown any sign of that shift. I began to understand something crucial about power dynamics. They don't collapse when you argue against them. They collapse when you stop participating. When you stop feeding them attention, reaction, and self-doubt. I wasn't withholding myself as punishment. I was conserving myself as policy. Friends noticed the change before I named it. One told me I seemed settled. Another said I carried myself differently. Like I wasn't waiting for someone to approve the version of me standing in front of them. Those comments felt grounding. Not flattering. Affirming. I also noticed how my relationship with money changed. Not in volume. In meaning. The money stopped being a symbol of validation or rebellion. Became a tool. Neutral. Practical. I budgeted without guilt. I invested without apology. I stopped framing financial boundaries as moral failures. That shift made my parents' earlier behavior even clearer. They hadn't just laughed at my dress. They had laughed at my autonomy, at the idea that I could define value on my own terms. That laughter no longer echoed in my head. It had lost its authority. I started saying no more often. Not just to family. To collaborations that felt extractive. To requests that assumed my availability. Snow created more room for yes that felt clean. Uncomplicated. Mutual. By the end of part 10, I realized something profound. I wasn't distancing myself from my family anymore. I was orienting myself toward a life that didn't require their permission to exist fully. That orientation changed everything. I wasn't bracing for the next conflict. I wasn't rehearsing future defenses. I wasn't hoping for reconciliation shaped like an apology. I was building forward. And once forward motion becomes your default, the past loses its grip. By the time part 11 began, I realized that the most significant change wasn't visible from the outside. Nothing dramatic had happened. No explosive argument. No tearful reconciliation. No final conversation where everything was said and understood. What had changed was internal, and because of that, it was permanent. I stopped waiting for their reaction. That might sound small, but it wasn't. For years, a part of my attention had always been oriented outward, scanning for response. Approval. Disapproval. Silence. I had measured my emotional safety by how calm or volatile they were. Even when we weren't speaking, they occupied space in my mind as a reference point. A silent audience. That audience was gone now. I noticed it one evening while closing the store. I was counting the register, the same ritual I'd done hundreds of times, when it hit me that I hadn't thought about my family all day. Not once. Not when a customer complimented a dress. Not when I adjusted a display. Not when I made a decision. The realization startled me more than any argument ever had. They no longer lived rent-free in my head. I thought back to the girl I'd been at that dinner, standing there in the $50 dress, smiling through the laughter, calculating how much of herself to give away to keep the peace. That version of me felt distant now. Not embarrassing. Not weak. Just unfinished. I felt compassion for her. And gratitude that she hadn't disappeared completely before I learned how to protect her. In the weeks that followed, the absence of my family became predictable. Occasional neutral texts. Holiday reminders without warmth. No follow-up. No curiosity. It was clear now that engagement had always been transactional. When I stopped offering value in the form they recognized, the connection thinned. That clarity no longer cut. It informed. I stopped interpreting their behavior as rejection. It wasn't personal. It was structural. They were incapable of relating to me without leverage. And without leverage, they didn't know how to reach me. Understanding that freed me from one last illusion. That if I explained myself perfectly, they would change. That there was a combination of words that could unlock respect. There wasn't. And there never had been. I also noticed how my nervous system responded to this acceptance. My body stopped preparing for impact. I wasn't bracing when my phone rang. I wasn't replaying conversations in the shower. I wasn't waking up with that low-grade anxiety I'd mistaken for normal. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated. Slowly. Quietly. Like sediment settling after a storm. I allowed myself to imagine the future without them at the center. Not as an act of defiance, but as an act of realism. Where I would spend holidays. Who I would call first with good news. Who would know my daily life. Those answers came easily now. They didn't include people who laughed at my worth and then tried to purchase it at a discount. That decision didn't harden me, softened me. Toward myself, I became more patient, more present, less reactive. I wasn't carrying unresolved anger anymore because I wasn't waiting for resolution from the wrong place. I had already given myself what I needed. Permission to move on without consensus. I realized then that boundaries aren't lines you draw for other people. They're lines you draw for yourself about what you will and will not carry. I had stopped carrying their discomfort, their disappointment, their refusal to see me clearly. That weight was never mine. Part 11 wasn't about triumph. It was about neutrality. About standing in my life without needing to justify why it looked the way it did. About understanding that being misunderstood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you is not a failure. It's a consequence of growth. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. And being done didn't feel like loss. Felt like completion. By the time part 12 arrived, I finally understood something that had taken me most of my life to learn. Closure is not a moment. It is not a conversation. It is not an apology that arrives late and uneven. Closure is a condition. And that condition is reached the moment you stop organizing your life around people who refuse to meet you with respect. Nothing dramatic happened to mark this ending. No confrontation. No final message where I laid everything out perfectly. No tearful realization on their side. And strangely, that absence felt right. Because if I was honest, the idea of a big emotional ending had always been another way of keeping them central. Another way of hoping they would finally validate what I already knew. I didn't need that anymore. I began to see my entire story with new clarity. Not just the dress. Not just the discount. But the years leading up to it. The subtle conditioning. The way laughter had been used as correction. The way just joking had softened humiliation until I learned to swallow it without complaint. The way my work had only become visible when it was useful to them. The way love had always arrived with terms and conditions written in invisible ink. Once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you can't keep pretending that compliance is kindness. I realized I had spent years confusing patience with maturity. Silence with strength. Endurance with love. I had believed that if I could just absorb a little more, explain a little better, compromise a little deeper, I would eventually earn a seat at the table where I wouldn't be laughed at. But the truth was brutal and freeing at the same time. Table was never meant for me as an equal. It was meant for me as support. As background. As someone who existed to make others feel bigger. Walking away from that wasn't dramatic. It was corrective. My life began to feel cohesive in a way it never had before. My decisions aligned with my values. My boundaries matched my energy. My work reflected my self-respect. I no longer made choices with an imaginary audience in mind. I no longer edited myself in advance. I no longer translated my needs into something more palatable. I stopped asking myself how things would be perceived and started asking whether they felt honest. That shift changed everything. The store grew not explosively but steadily. In a way that felt rooted. Customers returned. Word spread. People who valued what I offered found their way to me without needing discounts or explanations. For the first time, my livelihood didn't feel fragile. Felt earned. And protected. My personal life changed too. I chose relationships where respect was assumed, not negotiated. Where humor didn't come at someone else's expense. Where care didn't require self-erasure. I stopped overgiving to prove my worth. I stopped performing gratitude for things that cost me my dignity. And something unexpected happened. The more I respected myself, the less I needed anyone else to do it for me. My family still existed. Of course they did. They always would. But they no longer defined the architecture of my life. They were no longer the axis everything rotated around. They were part of the landscape, not the foundation. I didn't hate them. I didn't wish them harm. I simply accepted them as they were, without granting them access they had never learned to handle responsibly. That acceptance wasn't passive. It was powerful. I understood now that love without respect is not love. It's control dressed up as concern. And laughter that humiliates is not harmless. It's instruction. Teaches you where you belong. Or where you don't. The $50 dress still hangs in my closet. Keep it on purpose. Not because it's special, but because it reminds me of the moment I stopped shrinking. The moment I chose not to laugh along. The moment I realized my worth didn't increase or decrease based on someone else's reaction. They laughed at my dress. Then they asked for a discount. And in doing so, they revealed everything. They revealed that they didn't see me. They revealed that they expected access without respect. They revealed that my value in their eyes was negotiable. Mine is not. I didn't win anything in the traditional sense. I didn't get an apology. I didn't get validation. I didn't get reconciliation wrapped in accountability. What I got was better. I got myself back. I got clarity. I got a life that no longer bends to make room for disrespect. And that is not revenge. That is liberation.